Shalom, WJC family. It is time for our Torah Talk. This week in synagogue, we have a special Shabbat. It is Shabbat Chol HaMoed Sukkot, the Shabbat that falls during the week of the Sukkot holiday. And we have a special Torah reading. We read the book of Kohelet, the Megillah for Sukkot. A very special day in synagogue on Shabbat. I want to speak today a little bit about Sukkot. And the question is, why do we dwell in a sukkah? And from that question, I want to learn something even more significant about Judaism and about ritual and maybe even about ourselves. So the question is, why do we dwell in a sukkah? So maybe your answer is that we dwelt in Sukkot when we lived in the desert, after leaving Egypt and before we settled the land of Israel, and the Sukkah reminds us of that. Fair answer. Maybe your answer is that we had a harvest festival, and they used to dwell in Sukkot, right? The fields were outside of the walled towns, and to go back and forth every day, all the way out to your field and back into the walled town would take too much time. You couldn't get the grain harvested in time, so they dwelt in the fields this time of year as they went to harvest their wheat. They dwelt in a sukkah. Also, a fair answer. If you know your Talmud and maybe have a flair for the esoteric, maybe you would say that the Sukkah represents the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of God's presence. And to explain that answer, so just to point out three answers to the question why we dwell in a Sukkah, and just to flesh that one out a little bit, we know that in the Talmud there is a debate referred to between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva says that the booths are actual booths, like the booths we dwelt in the desert, and Rabbi Eliezer says the booth represents Ananei HaKavod, these clouds of glory, which is why the skach, the roof of the sukkah, has to be sort of porous and fluffy with leaves, and that's the explanation for the skach. So, which answer? Which is the right answer? How can we have this holiday with this very significant ritual of dwelling in booths and have three different answers as to why we dwell in these booths? Is it because it's a harvest festival and we dwelt in booths when we harvested? Is it because we lived in booths in the desert? This one is actually probably, it's Rabbi Akiva, so he's significant. It's probably the flimsiest explanation for the Sukkah, no pun intended, as the Sukkah is often very flimsy, because there's no indication in the Torah that we dwelt in booths in the desert. We dwelt in ohels, right, in tents. But fine. Or is it these Ananei HaKavod, the shelter of God that these clouds of God's presence put over us? And the answer is yes. The answer is that all of these explanations are good and fair explanations. That very rarely in Judaism is there one explanation for a ritual or a practice. And our holidays are a great example of this. Shavuot, we talk about Matan Torah, the gift of Torah, receiving Torah on Sinai, but also it's the harvest of the first fruits. And Passover also, we talk about, obviously, the Exodus from Egypt, but also we begin counting the Omer. It's the beginning of the grain growing season, the sowing season. So there's a harvest significance to all of these festivals, as well as their religious significance, their historical significance. We find this with so many Jewish rituals and so many Jewish practices. It is the ritual that is significant, but the ritual evolves over time and takes on new meanings. For example, when we read about the lighting of Shabbos candles in the Talmud, we read that they were practical, right? Shabbat was the only day you had to eat dinner after dark. No one did things after dark in an agrarian society without electric lights. Day started when the sun came up. Day ended when the sun went down, except on Shabbat, when it was a mitzvah to eat our meal on Shabbat, and we would go to the synagogue, and we would come home and it would be dark. We needed candles to eat by. Now, we don't need the candles for that reason anymore, but we still light them after 2,000 years of tradition. And we have these rituals that go along with it. We talk about them as bringing the light of holiness and sacredness into our house, and bring the light of the Shabbos HaMalka, the Shabbat Queen, into our home. That stuff isn't in the Talmud. But over time, as circumstances changed, so did the meaning of the rituals. The rituals themselves have a weight, a ritual gravity. They are significant actions. They have the weight of history, the weight of generations doing this for so long, the weight of holy interpretations, even if those interpretations, those sacred interpretations, are different. And it's okay. When it comes to the Sukkah, we can learn that it is all those things. It is a booth for the harvest, and a booth as a dwelling place representing the dwellings in the desert, and a booth that is flimsy and ethereal and yet protective, like the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory that protected us in the desert. Depending on what we want to teach or what we want to learn or what we're feeling in our heart, we might use any one of those explanations. And so too for explanations of how the world is working, explanations for God. This week in Shul, we're going to read a passage from Exodus about Moshe's great desire to see God, to apprehend exactly what, who, how this God is that he's been serving. And God can't tell him exactly. Right? God's like, oh, hide in the rock. I'm going to pass by. You'll see the trail of my presence, which is all any of us ever really see, depending on how we perceive the world. The trail of God's presence is all around us. But so how we interact with God in Judaism is not a fixed thing. Sometimes we have the God who is very transcendent, Ein Sof, Elohim, the creator of the world, very transcendent and distant and hard to understand and hard to fathom. And then sometimes we relate to God as very close to us. Adonai, El Shaddai, the personal names that God gave us to interact with God. Rofei Cholei Amo Yisrael, the healer of your people Israel. Oseh HaShalom, the one who creates peace, and so on and so forth. All these imminent names that we recognize God close to us. And again, depending what's going on in our lives, who we are in that moment, what's going on in the world in that moment, we might pick any one of these different ideas for relating to God. The point is that the words, the names of God are significant. The titles for God, the functions of these different names for God are significant, just as the rituals that we do on the holidays and at other times are significant. But we can ascribe to them, maybe part of their significance is that we ascribe to them all these different meanings, so that whatever's going on in our lives, we can find the place for holiness, for Judaism, for ritual, for God in that moment in our lives, in that moment, no matter who we are in that moment, what's going on for us in that moment. The Sukkah, as much as anything else, represents the grand, open nature of Judaism. That there's room for Jews with all different kinds of interests and people with all different kinds of interests, people on a Jewish journey, whether they're technically born Jewish or have chosen to become Jewish or on the path to doing that or are just Judeo-interested, and that's their Jewish journey. Everyone is welcome in the Sukkah. It's the grand, universal, international holiday of the Torah and on the Jewish calendar, and that's how the rabbis treated it. The Sukkah may be small, but there is room in the Sukkah for all kinds of explanation, all kinds of holiness, all kinds of people with all different perspectives on what it is to be Jewish, on what's most important about Judaism, the culture, the peoplehood, the religion, the national identity. It all fits in that little booth. It all fits in our Jewish practice. It all fits in our neshamas, in our Jewish selves. May this Sukkot holiday open us up to all the different interpretations, not only for ourselves, but to hear and appreciate and to empathize with those of others, even those who are not Jewish, who have other approaches to God that may yet have significance and wisdom in them from which we can learn. That's what this Sukkot holiday is all about. So I wish you a Chag Sameach. Enjoy dwelling in your harvest hut, or in your desert dwelling, or in your castle on the clouds that is the Sukkah. And may we all find our meaning and our place in the greater Jewish journey and in our own personal Jewish journey. Chag Sameach.